Nice. So who's still hungover from last night? Anyone? One guy in the back. One apparently 10-year-old. Who's still drunk from last night? No, oh, sorry. Okay, one guy in the back. I'll take it. This is all you get for 10 minutes, just so you know. Just setting the expectation. Deep Hadron Collider in Luxembourg, and yeah. I didn't make this, by the way. I have no claim to credit on this at all. I just stole it. What's up, man? I get it. What? There's treats? Oh. I make no promises. And grooves. Seagull, stop it now. Hi, John. Absolutely. See, it's how long you'll sit through the same video over and over again. Just barely past the IRB. No, I have 84 slides to go through. Don't worry. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes. 5-minute warning, just 5 minutes left of this video. The problem is my talk isn't as funny as this, so I'm kind of setting wrong expectations. Well, I would take no expectations. And that kind of morphed into OneNote, I think. Say that again? This is going to be tough for me to stay on this mic. I'm a wanderer when I talk, so I'm gonna try really hard. That's okay. I'll make it work. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrew Callett. Thank you for coming to my talk. I know it's rough on the last day of Derbycon, especially the last talk, at least talk slot. So I'm really happy people are here. I was afraid it was going to be me and my wife and some drunk hobos, but you're all here, so thank you. Fair. So I do want to try to get through my talk and leave some time for questions and not eat into closing ceremonies. So I've got about 93 slides, and then we'll be done. So good luck. I want to talk about changing our mindset from technical to psychological defenses. And I have an employee-mandated disclaimer. I also tell you I have very poor PowerPoint skills, so that's as good as it gets. That little animation slide, you're welcome. That's it. So I work for US Bank, and I'm not speaking for them in any way, shape, or form. There you go. So who am I? My name is Andrew Callett. I co-host the Defensive Security Podcast with Jerry Bell, who's here in the front row. Wow, thank you. If That's right, absolutely. This is my only shameless plug. If you're interested in Blue Team stuff, check it out. It might be useful to you. And I'll move on. I've been in IT security pretty much all of my career, so pretty much 25 years, and have worked for vendors, have worked for VARs, have worked for consultants, have worked for enterprises. Currently, I manage the boundary protection engineering team in the cyber defense department at US Bank. So we own a lot of the perimeter boundary stuff, but I've done many things over the years. And what we're going to talk about today is something that I've seen shifting a lot that I don't think that we're keeping up with, which is that a lot of the attacks that are really being successful have a large psychological component that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about or talking about in our industry. So hopefully it's interesting. So as I kind of hinted in my last slide, the bad guys, the bad actors, used to go through the front door. I mean, we had a whole industry built up around the concept of firewalls and scanning perimeter and really hardening our perimeters, wherever that perimeter may be, really hardening our devices, because most of the attacks were straight technical in nature. They wanted to find vulnerabilities, they wanted to find weaknesses, and attack them directly. And they really weren't as interested in any sort of user interaction at that point. And we as an industry have done a fairly good job of hardening against that if we can do everything that's prescribed to us and set things up. We are not so bad at defending against technical stuff in general in theory. Sometimes we have some challenges in implementation. But what the bad actors have done, in my opinion, is shifted to easier prey, or I would say more successful targets of going after people and going after the users and corporations, the end users, tricking them into getting them to do what the bad actors want them to do, sometimes without them even realizing it. And we aren't really keeping up with that, in my opinion, as an industry. We are very, generally as people, very technological. We are technology focused for a lot of us. And so this is kind of a challenge. This is one of those soft, gooey people issues that I personally was never very good at and still kind of suck at. So hence, I put together a talk that is things I need to work on myself. So a lot of our defenses are mainly technical, and a lot of our defenses are driven by a lot of our compliance and a lot of our regulatory agencies and a lot of our best practices and frameworks and all this other stuff that's out there. And if you need a new framework, I'm sure there's probably another one coming along any day now. And our budget, our staffing, our resources, how they're tasked is really focused around technical weaknesses. Are we patching? Are we applying two-factor authentication? Are we segmenting our environment? Are we documenting? Are we backing up? Are we restoring? All good things, but not really addressing a lot of psychological stuff. And our vendors, to be fair, are in the business of selling. And so they'll often define the problem as the problem they can solve, not necessarily the problem that we have. So they're very good at marketing to what their gear does and very good at just ignoring the stuff it doesn't do. So they're very good at driving the conversation around what they can do, not necessarily around the pain points we feel. And they're also very good at getting our senior executives to think about their problem statement, not necessarily the problem we really have. So the vendors have done a really good job of being the source of knowledge and thought leadership to a lot of our companies and our executives and decision makers. And I'll be honest, that's not doing us a great service sometimes. Because the vendors, and I've worked for a lot of vendors, including startups, we get into our own echo chamber of our own version of reality. And we get very good at objection handling and ignoring the weaknesses of our product, and then that comes across in how we talk to our customers. So this is why I'm always very skeptical of when vendors tell me they can solve my problem with just a nice little magic blinky box, and sometimes they can't. This is also a controversial statement that I'm going to make, but it goes into this concept, which is that we're often told that InfoSec is everybody's job, and everybody needs to participate in doing information security, and everybody needs to help. I would say it's not their job. In fact, straight up, their job is what gets them paid. Their job is what they're judged upon. Their job is what their boss is going to yell at them for not doing. This is also used against these people by our psychological attackers. So when you look at people and you look at how brains work, we have a finite amount of mental capacity. And we're dealing with something that is outside of our normal day-to-day, something we're not trained in, something we're not experienced in. That takes a lot more mental capacity. We as InfoSec practitioners in general in this room live, breathe, think this stuff. So it taxes us much less to think about this stuff typically than the average user in our company. So when we talk about InfoSec as everybody's job, I think that puts a lot of expectation and load on the users, which is a false sense of security. I think that they are going to do what they're judged upon, what they're motivated to do by their employer, their personal motivation, whatever their goals are. And that's usually not InfoSec. Hey, if it's a win and they can help us, great. But I think it's dangerous to rely on it. So they have limited time and energy. They're going to focus on the things they got to do. And right now, you know, if they're like most companies, they're stressed, they're busy, they've got a lot going on. If they can do some stuff with InfoSec, great, but I wouldn't depend on it. So what do I talk about when I'm talking about psychological attacks? It's anything that we typically talk about as social engineering, but there's a whole bunch of them. And what these typically are is some sort of aspect of utilizing our behavior against us, getting somebody to do something that we or the bad guys want them to do. So obviously I'm not going to read the whole list here, but you can see a lot of these. And these are all based on the concept of tricking somebody into doing something we wanted them to do. And we, as an industry, have this sort of arrogance sometimes of, hey, you know, that user was just dumb. They just, you know, fell for this attack. How could they click on that? But I tell you, the bad guys are getting very good at manipulating people into doing what they wanted to do. You know, a lot of people used to make fun of, you know, spam for being misspelled and having all these obvious tells in it. Well, that was the early days. That's not so much the case anymore, especially when people are going after, you know, enterprises. They're very good at duplicating and delivering to their target what they expect to see and what they're normally going to see. You know, a great example of this slide here is HR resume attacks. If you're in HR and you're a hiring person in HR, you have to open up resumes. That's your job. So a bad guy can use that against you. Here's a malware-laden document, right? So how can we tell those users, hey, don't open documents from strangers? That's their job. They have to do it every day. So then it, you know, it comes down to what can we do to let them do that safely, understanding that's going to be an avenue of attack. Another one is, you know, you can see great examples of social engineering contests at cons like Derbycon, DEFCON, a lot of the other cons. They're highly successful. And these are often, I think, not as well looked at as initial vectors for attack. And almost all the attacks we're seeing right now have that as an initial vector. Phishing is another one where we're doing, you know, voice-based phishing and spear phishing is getting really good. And a lot of the bad guys are utilizing this, and it's a cottage industry for them. They've got a script, and they're successful. So we have to realize that a lot of how we in our culture do things facilitates this. It's how our brains work, and it's being used against us. Hence the topic of my next slide. So a lot of the bad guys will target tasks that are required by our staff to complete, and they'll leverage innate or cultural helpness of people. A great example is calling up to a help desk at a target company, the IT help desk. They're there to help. They're judged on how quickly they can solve your problem. And much like many things in security, the more friction they put in that interaction, the more that the user is cranky and grumpy and unhappy, and then internal reports and internal, you know, feedback, it starts to get negative. So a lot of folks who are the bad guys know this, and they know where to find these little weak points in our culture, in our innate helpfulness in general, at least in the West. Not saying other cultures aren't helpful, I just don't know them as well. And they also know how to go after the reward systems of their victims. If I know that your job is to sell, and I can pose as a potential client, that triggers your reward system. You're very interested in that. If I know you need to hire people in HR, I can go after that with a loaded resume of some variety. If I know your help desk and your reward system is to help and to close tickets and move things, I go after that reward system. This is stuff that the bad guys know how to figure out what users are judged upon and use that against them. And again, we in IT security might have this concept of, wow, I can't believe they fell for that. But that's because we live and breathe this every day. I know I said this earlier. And they don't. And that's not a knock on them. They have other skill sets we don't have because they've spent their time developing a different skill set. But the bad guys know that. They're very rarely coming directly at the security team. Sometimes they do. They're going to go after the other folks who don't have this, weird interest that we often have. And this is also not new. Espionage organizations use this for years. If the Russians had a target in the US or someplace else, they'd figure out what that target cared about. Did they care about money? Did they care about fame? Did they care about sex? Did they care about, attention from women? And then they would craft their attack based on that. So this isn't new. And, I'm not trying to play, Jason Bourne up here. I think sometimes we get a little caught up in that. I'm saying that these philosophies and tactics and capabilities are nothing new, but they're also not something we can easily just deploy a patch against or easily change. So they're not going to go away very easily. The other thing that I wanted to talk about at this point is that human performance is highly variable. We seem to have this expectation that we train users or we teach them and that they're going to have the same level of performance on a regular, consistent basis. It's simply not true. It's not how we work. Coming off the party last night, some of us might be a little slow today, right? Some of us might still be drunk. I don't know. And there's so many factors that go into what influences our capabilities at any particular point in time. So if we as technologists and as InfoSec folks expect our users to have the same level of judgment every single time, make the same call on a suspicious email every single time, make the right call every time they get a weird phone call, that's really dangerous to think and assume that. There's always things that are going to impact that performance. And I'll give you a little spoiler. One thing I didn't tell you early on, which is rare, because normally within 5 minutes I tell people, I'm a private pilot. I've flown for 20 years. One of the things we use in aviation is something called the I'm Safe checklist. And this is something to judge whether or not you are fit to fly, because these are items that impact your readiness, your judgment, your capabilities. And so it's illness. Am I sick? Am I not feeling well? Am I hungover from a party the night before? Am I on any medication? Have I taken cold pills or something that might make me foggy or slow down my judgment and my capabilities? Am I under a lot of stress? Stress has a huge impact on our ability to make judgment calls. But we don't even realize it, how badly it can degrade our capabilities when we're under a lot of stress. And what's a high stress environment? Most people at their job, especially when deadlines are coming up or their project is running behind. Have I been drinking? That clearly, as we all know, and fatigue is another huge area of judgment degradation. There's been a lot of research on fatigue. Fatigue has caused a lot of major aviation accidents. It's caused a number of nuclear accidents. And we in IT tend to work really long hours. And so do our users sometimes. So this isn't just about the users in our organization, it's also about us. What degrades our capabilities? This is sometimes why I'm a manager. I manage 7 guys. I yell at them if I see them working more than 50 hours. If I see them there at 7 o'clock at night, I yell at them. I say, go home. Unless we're in a Sev 1 issue, go home. Take your vacation. I'd rather people be rested and ready. They're going to make better judgment calls. Working more does not mean working better, basically. Eating and hunger has actual very measurable impacts on judgment and capabilities. Fear has a huge motivator. If I'm afraid I'm not going to hit my bonus targets, if I'm afraid my boss is going to be mad at me, if I'm afraid that This guy on the other end of the phone has a video of me enjoying some pornographic video that he's about to send to all my contacts, which is a current scam going around. Probably all of you know that. That drives behavior. Fear is an incredible motivator. How I'm compensated drives my behavior tremendously in the workplace. I can usually, predict a sales team's behavior based on their comp plan. I was a sales engineer for 10 years. How they're paid, straight up is how they're going to behave. Same thing happens with people. What do they get paid for? That's what they're going to do. They want to get paid. And metrics, how we measure performance, how we measure success in an organization, absolutely has an impact in behavior. If people are measured on call rates, close rates of tickets, and not necessarily successful tickets, they're going to close tickets fast. If people are measured on how quickly a patch is deployed, but not how successfully a patch is deployed, that's what they're going to do. So metrics drive a ton of behavior. So as an aside to this talk, I would say that one thing that I'm always so gun-shy about is metrics and how metrics are created and judged and used in organizations, because they are such a hammer to drive bad behavior. So something to be aware of. And by the way, just as a quick side note, if you do give up and leave halfway through my presentation, know that I will cry in the corner. You're welcome to do it, but there are consequences. If you want to sleep, rock on. So I haven't done any original research in this area, but I've read a ton of reports about how social engineering and stress impact each other. So the success rates. Higher stress levels reduce critical thinking skills. Straight up known, proven fact. So if I can go after my targets when they're under a lot of stress as a bad guy, I have a higher likelihood of them not having critical judgment skills at their peak. I know that when they've got competing priorities, when they're distracted, whatever their culture that leads them to do certain things, all these things lead to social engineering success. And, in general, I don't talk about this stuff typically when I'm designing defenses. I talk about what's the latest user behavior anomaly detection tool I'm going to load, or what's the latest SIM module that we're going to load. But we don't talk about this. Time and day of the week impact social engineering success. I think it's in here somewhere. Thursday is by far the most successful day that, I'm getting attacked by a bug, the most successful day, oh man, actually, oh, all right, thank you. Okay, so, nice. All right, for those who didn't know, my partner in crime, Jerry, also got one. Okay, so. How many is this your first Derbycon? Wow. Holy cow. All right. First of all, welcome. I'm still getting attacked by a bug. If you don't know what this is about 100-degree Smirnoff Ice, original. And this happens sometimes at Derbycon. Now, what Jerry has forgotten that there's a secondary option to drinking this, which is a donation to the Hackers for Charity Fund. Jerry's going to do both. Look at that. All right. No. All right, so what do you guys think to avoid drinking this? $20 to charity? Yeah. More. 50. Here, 50. You guys are contributing, right? That's 50. All right, 50. 20. Oh, we're back down to 25. For me to not drink it. Good plan. I appreciate that. All right, tell you what. I'm going to do 100 to Hackers for Charity, and I'll take... And I'll at least try it. You know what? It's not bad. I might have a new favorite. I'm going to finish that. All right. I have no idea what I was talking about. Right. Thank you. Time of day of the week definitely impacts social engineering success rates. And I've got another slide on this, so I don't want to steal some of my own thunder. Pretexting is where you're pretending to be somebody else. If you pretext as an authority figure, That has a huge impact to social engineering success rates, i.e. CEO fraud. Sorry, look, 3 sips and I'm already drunk. The concept of I need to get my CFO to send a money order or a deposit or a wire of $4 million to this secret business deal that we've got going in China. That authority goes back to fear and compensation, and that person is telling me what to do and I've got to believe them. So again, this is all just psychological issues. And some of you may be saying, yeah, this is pretty obvious. I think it is, but I don't think we think about it enough in our day-to-day job. Aw, my clicker died. So stealing some stats from some other people. 2017 Verizon data breach report, which, by the way, big props to those guys. They do a great job. 43% of all breaches involve some manner of social engineering. I need a drink. 93% of those 43% included phishing. So obviously email is a huge vector of attack, and it's highly successful. It was used in 88% of financial fraud attacks, and 28% of those phishing attacks were targeted. In other words, rather than a broad spread, it was at very specific people, typically with very specific knowledge about that individual and used in that attack. So we have facilitated business with email, and email is a wonderful tool, but we're also facilitating the hackers and the bad guys. I shouldn't say hackers, the bad actors. And we don't really arm or protect our users very much in general from this. We're good at detecting, for the most part, malware. We're good at detecting some credential harvesting, but there's a lot of stuff. We're seeing social engineering that works now where, hey, we're going to send this targeted attack. First, I'm going to call them and tell them to expect my email, and then I'm going to send the email. So that quickly defeats the training of don't click on unexpected emails, right? Very easy to get around. Hey, more stats. According to the IBM Human Factors Report and others who have very similar research, users are most likely to open spam and phishing emails in the morning. And usually they're more likely to open them if they're engaged in their email system when it arrives. So it's not just sitting there queued up. So typically we see most of the phishing and spam and email-borne attacks happening around 9 to 11 a.m. local to the target around the world. And Thursday has by far the largest volume of malicious emails and success rates. And that has to do with stress in the week. That has to do with how the business week flows for those countries that are Monday through Friday. It has to do with a lot of different things that impact our psychology. And so it's amazing because I think a lot of companies have this concept, hey, we do user training and we teach them and they're taught. And then what? We do simulations and we find the ones who fall for it. But again, we don't think about this stuff very often, in my opinion. Because, by the way, there's not a lot of easy solutions. It's part of the problem. Vendors and help desks. Help desks are incredibly easy targets because they're meant to help, right? I'm an upset, pissed off VP at a company. Not really, I'm a bad actor. But my password doesn't work. I call the help desk and I start getting angry. I start throwing names around. It's real easy to get that help desk typically to do what I want. They don't want to be in trouble. They don't want to get yelled at. That's their job. And if we don't arm them with process and procedure they can hide behind and be defended for following, they're going to make mistakes like this. Companies are meant to be easy to do business with. It's very easy for you to go after companies like salespeople and that sort of thing because they're meant to be frictionless. They know the easier they are to do business with, the more business they're going to get. Amazon, one-click ordering. They know that. So this is a big challenge we have, is that the easier we are to do business with, and whatever it is, the service we're facilitating, the easier we can be scammed because we've got less friction in that interaction. We've got less friction and less opportunity to sanity check or put policy or process around that interaction. And there is no good answer. Like anything, it's the balance of security versus usability. And we've got to find that balance for a lot of these things. And we'll talk about some specifics and some specific ways that we can help as we get a little further in. I think I'm on slide 10 of about 106, so we're doing good. Tasty. Absolutely. Physical security. And this is one we hear about all the time, but I just want to throw it in because it's true. We are polite people in general. You know, yeah, except for me, most days before coffee. But we are polite, and we're taught to hold doors for people and help them. And this is so used against us so easily. You know, you hear all these social engineering success stories of how I got my badge and I put on my UPS uniform and I walked right in. Yeah, because that's how things work. People have 1,000 things to do. So we hold the door for those behind us. We let them tailgate in. And yes, we try to beat that out of people's mindset with training, but they're still going to do it, right? And so what do we do realistically in this industry is when it really, really, really matters, we put in a man trap because we know that people are going to be polite and helpful. We trust those who appear to belong. Our brains, whether we like it or not, are wired to short circuit to make this very complex world easier to deal with. And if things look like they belong, they don't look out of the ordinary, they don't look weird, I'm less likely to question it and challenge it. We might as IT folks, but not our average user, most likely, unless we have very strict process procedure we'll talk about. So, delivery person, appropriate uniform, easily copied employee badge, confidence to be there. I'm not actually a speaker. I faked this whole thing. It even matters when your life is on the line, and it happens. So I grew up in Detroit, and actually I remember this happening. I heard this happen from where I lived. This was a highly experienced flight crew, right? So we're going to talk about people can make judgment mistakes when it matters so much they die. People still make judgment mistakes. So to expect our folks who are just trying to get through the day not to make a judgment mistake is a high order. So the flight crew was extremely experienced. The captain had 31 years with Northwest, now part of Delta, if you're curious. The first officer had 8 years with the airline. They were extremely experienced in that particular type of aircraft. They had, I think, combined over 20,000 flight hours. They were taxiing to the runway for takeoff in Detroit and got distracted during their checklist by a change in taxiway directions and a change in runway. And as they were distracted following their checklist to get the plane ready for takeoff, they missed a key flap setting to set the wing in the appropriate condition for takeoff. And they crashed on takeoff, and 154 of the 155 people aboard died. So I'm not trying to bring this down. In fact, I'll make it light by having a drink. But we have to understand that people make mistakes even when their lives and other people's lives are on the line. And what can we do to help them? So what can we do now that I've laid out all this doom and gloom? We need to think about this sort of issue the same way we think about any sort of technical control we put in place. There are things we can do. We can take people out of the judgment loop. We can take individuals out of the judgment loop, but we reduce their flexibility and we reduce their helpfulness when we do it. But we minimize their chance of making a judgment call mistake by forcing them to follow a specific procedure. So right up front, I'm going to say that this is a very much a flexibility, culture versus security problem. And there is no perfect answer. It's a balance between that. And so there may be certain processes and procedures in your company that you just cannot afford a bad judgment call on, perhaps like releasing more than $1 million, that you want to have a very strict procedure that cannot be skipped. We'll talk about that. I don't want to ever blame the users. I used to kind of be a little bit more arrogant about that. I used to be a little bit more, man, stupid users. What do these sales guys know? They're filling their laptops with porn. But I've come around to realizing that that doesn't fix or change anything. And I've come around to realizing that they could be just as smart and just as talented in their area of whatever it is they do that they've spent their life doing, or they could be dumb, I don't know. And they have just a different motivation. They have a different reward system. And that's something we kind of need to keep in mind. What we care about every single day, they really don't give a damn about. They're just trying to get their job done and do whatever it is that's going to make their boss happy and their spouse at home happy and just get through the day. And, we've got to keep that in mind. We have to assume that people are going to be targeted successfully. So even after we go through all the training, all the awareness, all the technical controls, I think for stuff that really matters, you've got to assume we're still going to fall for it. We're still going to get targeted successfully. The bad guys are going to find somebody having a bad day is going to click on the link at the wrong time. So we've got to plan for that human failure, because humans do fail, and they will always fail. And that's not a knock on us. It's just reality. So what can we do? When we start planning for failure, we start realizing that we need to be resilient in our systems around it. So it's things like having multiple ways to catch that mistake. Multi-factor is a good one. If a user falls for a phishing attack or a credential harvesting attack, in general, multi-factor for most things can mitigate that to a certain extent as a technical control. Training and awareness certainly are helpful. It will lower your incidence rate, but it's not the catch-all. And I think what really comes down to it, as much as it may suck and be soul draining for folks, is very strict process and procedures that are very well thought out around really critical decision points. Because those are the areas where we can't afford to have people make mistakes. Talked about that. We can also start doing some psychological red teaming, if you will. Figure out how could our folks' reward systems and culture and business philosophies enable these problems, and how can we use that? How can we help that? And if possible, where things that really matter, how can I take an individual solo human judgment out of the equation and get at least two folks, right? I mean, we'll look at business email compromise or CEO compromise, where the CFO gets that email that says, this is really, really sensitive and really secret, and we're in negotiations for this really important acquisition. You can't tell anybody, but I need you to wire $4.3 million. I swear there's a bug up here. I'm not going crazy. $4.3 million to, it's all right, to Nigeria, and you can't tell anybody. That's the kind of thing where it's appealing to a whole bunch of sense of reward system and authority for that user, but it's also not allowing them to sanity check that with anybody. We can't allow that. We've got to find ways to build policy and procedure that skips that sort of only one person can make a call on really important things. Now, the flip side of this is this slows business down, and it's gonna piss people off. But it's how we protect our companies. And as best we can, we need to back up these judgment calls with technology and where we can. We can't fix all the problems with technology, but if we know that this is a weak area, if we know that there's a chance somebody can make a bad call here, how can I help them with technology so if they do make the bad call, it minimizes that impact? Things like not letting folks run as admin on their computer so that if somebody does get a foothold, at least they don't have admin rights. And hardening it, understanding that that endpoint is gonna get popped. How can I minimize that lateral movement? How are we doing on time? All right, good. We talked about this a little bit, strict processes. For heavy impact items, consider creating non-avoidable process. Things that even the CEO or the board can't go around, especially in a time of crisis. That there needs to be a very methodical plan to change that process policy. Spending over $1 million requires as an example, 3 company directors to verbally confirm and digitally sign. Now, sure, a bad guy could still find a way out of this. They could find that edge case, but it makes it a lot harder. Train that staff to never skip or deviate from that established process under penalty of firing, including the CEO. That takes a lot of discipline as a company. That takes a lot of cojones. Help desk is a great example of this, and we've got a slide on this later. If the help desk is there to reset passwords, if they've got a strict process that they cannot avoid to identify a user, is that user before they reset the password, that's great. It's going to upset people. I promise you that. but it mitigates the ability of a bad guy to come in and get a password reset or a password issued. This will slow down business, and it may not be desirable. So that's something we got to keep in mind and make that balance. Another lesson from aviation. Aviation has a very deep culture of risk management, and they have, because people's lives are on the line. They, you know, from my personal experiences have, and you know, take this with a grain of salt, one of the more robust risk management philosophies of other areas, of any area of life I've dealt with. There's probably similar in like nuclear engineering and that sort of thing, but I don't know much about that. They know detailed stats about where risky areas of a typical flight is. So for instance, taxi, takeoff, and climb and landing are the riskiest parts of flight. The cruise stage is the least risky. So by identifying where we have these risky areas, they can start to put mitigations in place. I'll give you a side story from aviation. Before the development of, I believe, the B-17, we never used checklists in aviation. Just wasn't a thing. Just pilots knew what to do, and they just did it by memory. Until one day, somebody forgot to take the elevator lock off the back of a B-17, which keeps the thing that pivots on the back from moving, and they went out to do a test flight, and they couldn't control pitch. So they took off the B-17 and did a big loop and crashed. And in the post-crash analysis, they realized that they made a mistake. They'd forgotten this key step. And that's where checklists started to come into play. And now checklists are the lifeblood of aviation. In theory, we shouldn't do anything without a checklist. If you remember Hump for October, Russian don't take a dump without a plan, son. Very similar for aviation. So in this case, the way aviation deals with this is they identify very risky areas, and they put mitigations in place to study and reduce those risks within their organization. Now, aviation relatively is static, I will say that, compared to how quickly our businesses change and flow. So it's a lot easier for something like aviation to look very deeply at things. Things don't change rapidly in aviation. But we can apply a similar concept. And so one of the things aviation does is they look at human factors, something I don't think we do a good job in IT security at all. It's a whole field of investigation of how humans work. I'll give you another example from aviation. In the early days of aviation, the captain of the aircraft was a god. He was called a sky god, at least in the Pan Am era. And they ran that flight like a military crew. Now what happened is, early days, we had as many as 4 people in the cockpit. There are plenty of instances where some of the other secondary crew members noticed something very wrong, but were afraid to challenge the captain. They were afraid to speak up. They were afraid to tell him he was wrong. This is one aspect of a concept of human factors. Now what we have in aviation that we beat into folks very heavily is this concept of crew resource management, where anybody in the crew, if they see something wrong, it is their important duty to speak up and challenge it. In fact, if you look at the Asian Air Asia, thank you. No, not Korean. The one that crashed in San Francisco a couple years back. That was an example of an Asian culture. People don't challenge the captain very well. And one of their flight crew realized that they didn't have the auto thrust set properly, but was afraid to challenge the captain. We try to beat that out of people in aviation. So similar thing, I think, in IT. If somebody sees, hey, we're about to do something real risky and really silly, raise your hand. Now, at the end of the day, if management says, hey, we acknowledge that you've said this, but we're still going to take this risk anyway, okay, business is risk. But there's all sorts of risky areas that we should focus more on. Adding a new server, especially if it's internet-facing. Have we done all the right things for that? Do we have a checklist to follow? Do we have a methodology that must be followed before we throw that server out on the internet? Firewall changes. Make sure we don't accidentally push an any except rule. Do we have 2 people checking that work? Deploying new technology. Do we know that the default passwords have been successfully changed? In other words, we can identify these areas that are common for us to make mistakes and wrap some process around it so we don't have to make an individual judgment call every single time and hope we make it right every single time. especially when things are complex. Complexity can quickly grow beyond our memory capabilities to handle. I'm beholden to checklists. I like checklists, but you can find other ways to do this. You can do this in all sorts of tools. Minimizing distractions in key segments of flight. We have something called a sterile cockpit rule. Typically on takeoff and landing, there's no non-vital communication. We suck at multitasking as humans. We like to think we're good at it. We're terrible at it. So I would say that we, especially if we're in leadership, can do a good job of minimizing distractions to our employees when they're doing really critical work, and try to let them focus is one thing I would say. And we talked about cockpit resource management a little bit. iChart, I know, but here's an example of just, if you've never seen one before, a checklist for starting up a Cessna 172. So all the stuff you do to check all the stuff ahead of time, how you start the engine, and if you've flown for years and years and years and years, you probably have this by memory. But we still, if we're doing risk management properly, take the time to go through every one of these. And if we get interrupted, start over, so we don't miss something key. And then there's an emergency checklist. Everything in aviation is a checklist. So, we've got a critical incident. The worst time to think about what you're going to do in a critical incident is during the critical incident. So what is your plan if you recognize you get hacked or Krebs gives you a phone call? Ideally, you've got that figured out ahead of time, and it should be on a list. Now, hopefully this is a well thought out and appropriate list, but this is stuff that smart people have spent a lot of time figuring out and have pre-made the judgment call to help you go forward. And this is a good philosophy from another area of risk management I think we can bring into IT security and bring into risky areas to minimize these judgment attacks. Here's just a silly, quick list I came up with. Hey, we're adding a new internet-facing server. Have we done all these things? Update the firmware, update all the patches, turn off unnecessary services, uninstall unnecessary software, configure DNS, make sure the right firewalls and only the right firewalls are in place, et cetera, before we put it out there. So I'm not having to make the call every time, right? And oh, by the way, when I get some vendor pushing me to do it faster, sorry, I got a process I have to follow or I get fired, is a great way to counter a lot of BS. Same thing for resetting a help desk password. This is kind of based on perhaps some pre-existing stuff, but verify the username, verify their employee ID number, verify against a preset secret question that was set ahead of time when that employee came on board. Call the user back at a known best number if possible. Again, all these are subvertible. We can be edge case extremists if we want, but if unable to call back, ask additional verification questions. And maybe if I've got some user behavior analysis, flag that account to be watched a little more closely because it was recently reset. If I suddenly see it logging in from Ukraine, I want to know about that. So things like that can really reduce the likelihood of somebody using our own helpfulness against us. But I'll tell you, this will annoy your users. They want it quick and easy. That's the trade-off. All right. So my summary. As we talked about, the bad guys have shifted to attacking people, not technology. We will have lapses in judgment, no matter how good and smart we are, especially as we get older and drink at parties. We have to help our users, not blame them. And we got to start realizing that bad guys are going to come after our brains, and how can we find those high-risk areas and build process and controls around them that cannot be skipped, that minimize the ability to be used against us. And with that, I will take questions, and here's how you can get a hold of me. Thank you very much, guys. Any questions? Yes. So the question is, if you're not in leadership to really invoke these kind of controls and you're in an environment that doesn't have it, how do you sell them on it? That's a great question, and it's a really tough thing to do. you're not easily going to change the culture of your company. So the first thing you can do is the things within your sphere of control, and perhaps demonstrate it. You can champion it. You can start to try to raise that awareness. But it's tough to turn the Titanic, and it's tough to get them on board if they're not willing to be on board. Sometimes, occasionally, you got to let them touch the hot stove and then say, hey, I know how we can stop that from happening again. And I will tell you, there is no risk-free way to do business. And our executives every day long are inundated with knowledge and concerns and risks and complaints and issues. And they have to balance which is the most critical, which is my long way of saying, I don't know. It's very tough. I would just say, try to raise awareness and build some allies and slowly push them, but without upsetting them and, causing issues. Yes?
What would you say are some first steps towards coming up with a agreed upon set of templates for standardized?
Yeah, the question is, what's the first step for coming up with agreed upon checklists that can be used across multiple organizations? I would say identifying high risk areas, password resets, account creation, and then trying to figure out what the process in the organization is that's ideal, poking holes in it from a red team perspective, thinking about it, how would a bad guy subvert it, and then trying to figure out how can I counter that subversion if possible. But it's so subjective to the individual company and the individual situation. Money is a good one. Let's say we don't often in our section of the world handle this, but a good example is spending over $1 million or whatever the appropriate level is for your company. Getting 3 director level above sign-offs before that can happen. Again, it slows things down, but it prevents, 1, embezzlement, 2, any sort of business email compromise, credential theft, that kind of thing.
Not only between all these systems, how do I know who you are or you are? We do PKI for that all the time. But developing trust between people.
So you're saying use blockchain?
Right. No. What I'm saying is how to develop trust between people, but you obviously don't want to trust somebody inherently.
Right.
There needs to be reasons why you trust somebody. So do you think that would apply well to something? Are there any thoughts you have on that?
Possibly. So to try to summarize the comment of the question is, we do a good job of trying to establish technical trust through PKI and private key, and I'm so old I remember PGP key signing parties. So how do we do that with humans? I think we do it innately, and then it's used against us, right? So the question is, how do the technical aspects of it can be, with humans, can be subverted, right? If I can break into my CEO's email and send emails as him, people trust that that's the CEO when they do what they say. So it's more a matter of how do I untrust without verification, right? Or challenge the trust without upsetting too many people or slowing down business too much, in my mind. So if anything, we're too trusting. Yeah, especially you. Any other questions? Thank you, guys. Oh wait, one back there. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, you bring up a great point, and it's one of the key weaknesses to InfoSec in general. I will. So the question, the comment is, ultimately, the executives don't want to follow hassles like this, and they're usually the ones most likely to ignore this, especially in emergency, and low-level employees are the least likely to challenge senior executives, and you're absolutely correct. And the funny thing is the high-level executives are the one who are most likely to be targeted by these high impact things, they're the most likely victims and the ones who most likely need protection and help around this, which makes it really extra maddening. So I think you've got to get their buy-off and you've got to get their buy-in to have any chance at all of possibly enforcing these policies. And, 100% utilization might be a stretch too far, realizing that sometimes they're probably going to break their own policy. But if you could stop a couple of potential impacts, might be worth it. But yeah, that's a problem that we see across the board, is that executives just don't want to be bothered with this stuff. And it's a real challenge. But that's also what the bad guys are counting on. So it's a real challenge. I don't have a really good answer other than trying to educate and inform. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, so really good feedback there is that, yeah, if you've got a board and you're a big enough company, the comment was, one of the best ways to go about this is the board enforcing that on the executives if possible, because the board hires and fires the executives, typically, usually, hopefully. Hey, more questions. Yes, sir.
So on your case, who is your next line of reporting, and what do you see as the pros and cons?
In my day-to-day job, so I report to a VP at US Bank, and they don't listen to anything I have to say on this front. So, the US Bank has 80,000 employees, and I've been there about a year. So I'm still learning the ropes and figuring some of this stuff out. We have so much process and procedure and red tape, it's insane, and I probably can't talk too much about that. But in some ways, we have too much. In the other areas, we might be too weak. I can't talk about my own employer too much, but some stuff I see them do well. Other areas we probably have some room for improvement. It's just tough, especially at scale. When you get up to tens of thousands of employees, it gets really tough because you don't know who everybody is, and it's I think probably like a 5,000 person employee company is a good sweet spot for enough budget to do this without being too onerous, but I think you can do it. You just need a lot more executive buy-in. So I apologize that I can't talk too much about my own company. I think somebody else, did you have your hand up? Sure. Right. So the comment is, yeah. No, it's a good point. And it's actually a good point across the board too. So a couple good points there. One, tailor your training and awareness to different levels in the company, not just one set of training across everybody, because they have different needs, wants, concerns, drives, goals. And when possible, do spearfishing testing with your executives, although sometimes they limit themselves out of those tests, which is maddening. And show them the weaknesses and the failures, and show them examples from other companies of the weakness and failure, and try to get them to buy off on those controls. I think that was a good summary. Is that okay? Okay. Yes?
So I do fishing every day for a company called Fish Labs.
Sure.
We did a great fishing campaign. It was really good. On the first day of school, we put out a new active shooter. We got really high click rate. But my concern is the psychological aspects of doing stuff like that. Because what we've also seen is we've seen repercussions from the employees as far as how they do fishing, et cetera. Because now they're just totally scared of opening up anything.
Yep.
I mean, it's adverse to their ability to communicate with customers as well as their ability to also get the job done. So how is it that you see this developing?
Yeah, in some ways we've almost gone overboard, right, in scaring them. And the comment is, works for a company that does fishing simulations every day, and that they're seeing some impacts of users changing their behavior of how they interact with email and such because they're afraid of this stuff. I think that shows that we may have to evolve our email methodologies a bit, although that's really, really, really difficult. It's like replacing Microsoft Word with something else. It's incredibly difficult. Email is so built into our culture. I think some people are gun shy, but I think ultimately some people are forced to use email to be productive at business, that they're not going to have a choice. In an individual life, they could probably avoid that sort of thing, but in a workplace environment, I think most folks have to use email. And so I think we could probably teach them some good habits, but it's also what can we do to help protect them with technology as best we can. And I think we're in a weird place with that. I think we've enabled so much communication that's being used against us. I don't know that we're doing a good job coping with that. And I think that we're still evolving that in many ways. And you know, secondary means of communication might be a good thing too. If it's really important, we'll SMS all